let me begin by saying that I'm so sorry, I owe you an apology. I was in another meeting. This took longer than we expected, and I was not able to run away. It's a pleasure having you all here at the Center for Research on North America. That happily we are a distinguished member of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I want to give a special thanks to my colleague and friend Paola Suarez. She has made possible to have you here today, and I'm pretty sure that you enjoyed the tour around the main campus of UNAM, and most probably you were able to listen a little bit about our very long history. I don't know if it's almost very young students, the ones who conduct these guided tours, and I don't know if he or she gave you all some numbers about the dimension, the current dimension of this institution in terms of the number of students.
She did, yeah, like here and then, but also the other campuses.
It's a little bit more of 350,000 students and more than 35,000 faculty members. Of course, we do not all are lucky enough to do our work in Ciudad Universitaria. This is we have a different campus, not only in the suburbs of Mexico City, but the university has launched quite recently a quite ambitious program in terms of having sort of satellites of UNAM. One is in Morelia, Michoacán. The other one is in León, right in the Bajío. And some other institutions from UNAM are, for example, in Mérida, which is expected to grow in the short run. So anyway, I know that you all know who I am. My parents decided that I needed to be called Sylvia. I don't know why. And I'm Sylvia García. I have been the director of this institution almost for, well, it'll be 8 years by the end of August. That means that I'm packing my stuff already and seeking for political asylum somewhere, most probably in Europe. Because we have two terms, as if you are the rector of the university or you are the director of any entity from the university, it's only 2 terms, 4 years, the same as the White House. And I have been very happy doing what I, not only the leader of this academic project, but basically because I see myself as if I was born in this institution. The institution has already 27 years, and I was one of the first 5 scholars who were invited to participate in this center. At the beginning of our story, I don't know if it's a history, but a story, it was basically a center for doing U.S. studies. We were focusing on U.S.-Mexico relations, basically from the political and economic perspective. But we knew that it was necessary to broaden our scope of research, that is to say, to incorporate not only culture, but also society as a whole. So this institution was born as a multi and an interdisciplinary research unit. It is also relevant for me to mention that since the beginning and until today, we are, there is an interesting gender component. the numbers are not wrong. I'm making all these numbers because I had to present an 8th annual, it's not an annual, it will be my term, last report. And we are playing with numbers. I think 85, probably a little bit more than 85 or 87% of us here in this institution, when we talk about researchers, we are proud to be one. We see that's quite unusual, especially because we have devoted our story, our history to work, not only with hard power issues such as NAFTA, security, organized crime, drug trafficking, but because we put a special attention in terms of society and culture, for us it is also very relevant to put a particular attention in soft power issues. So when I talk about soft power, let me just mention that an interesting group of us are focusing on literature, cinema, and how all these questions truly are incorporated in, in terms of a vision of the construction of North America. The center began we began getting all these requests when we were born, doing U.S. and U.S.-Mexico studies, because in the year, by the 1990s, 1989, it was the year when we started working here. You should remember that the Berlin Wall happened on that particular year, and there was all these incentives about trade already in the world, and the issue of the North American free trade agreement began to heat up, and we were getting all these requests about they wanted information about the political system of Canada, the history of Canada, not the story. That came after. Now we are undergoing a story with Canada. We began getting all these requests about understanding Canada. So it was necessary for us to incorporate the study of Canada, and I'm very proud to say that for Mexico, I believe this is the most relevant institution that have been able to develop Canadian studies as a whole, in a holistic perspective, the same that we have in terms of understanding the United States. So when NAFTA was put into place, we came to the conclusion that it was necessary to transform our institution, and this is the reason why we became the Center for Research on North America, as we incorporated Canadian studies within this institution. Each director of this center has had different approaches in order to articulate our research. At the very beginning, they decided that it was much better to talk about our research geographically. That is to say that some of us were focusing on Canadian domestic issues, some others were focusing on the United States, and a third party were focusing on comparative research. Mexico and the United States, or Mexico and Canada. Very little was done in terms of Canadian-U.S. comparative research. there were very few of us, and you must understand that when you start launching such an ambitious project as Canadian studies, it was necessary to give some time for many of our researchers. They had the potential, but they were not Canadianists as a whole. So they decided that it was geography, but then when I came to be the director, after being the associate director for 13 years. So I was the associate director with two former directors of the center until I got the opportunity to be what I am currently. I decided that it was much better to articulate our research from different perspectives. So nowadays we are still working in 3 different areas. One is strategic studies, the other one is integration, and the third is global issues. Because we believe that was basically a more ambitious approach, but the stage of our own research was already giving us the possibility, for example, to start a comparison between what was going on in North America and what is happening in Europe, the European Union. And also because in terms of, basically in terms of economics, I must say that some colleagues were already kind of aware about the relevance of the China factor within the integration of North America. So we are currently articulated in these 3 areas, remember, integration, global issues, and strategic ones. We are 22 full-time researchers. Each one of us needs to carry the responsibility of at least one individual research project, and we could we could promote, but we could also be involved in collective research. And we have a huge array of collective and individual projects. I'm not going to take time from your agenda by mentioning each one of them. Let me just give you the hint of the issues we are studying currently, so that you will have the possibility to serve our webpage, which is already in English and Spanish, and maybe the next leader of this research project might like it in Chinese. Not in French, unfortunately, although we do recognize that French is the 3rd language of North America, and this is the reason why I requested our peer review magazine, which is one of the top actions of this academic project. For publishing in this peer review magazine, you can send contributions either in Spanish, English, or in French. Okay? So let me just mention that we are currently focusing on migration. That is one of the most strong areas, in a certain way, of study. Paola is in fact working on migration and higher education, but some others who are focusing on migration are studying, for example, migration and human rights, migration policies in North America, what else? Highly qualified migration. And we have been pretty well in terms of migration studies, and this was the reason we were able to host an international conference, the conference of the Metropolis International. I don't know if you have heard about Metropolis International. So I'm a member of the steering committee since long ago, and I was able to present the bid with the support of the rector of the university and the former foreign affairs minister, and we won the bid to host that relevant conference. It took place in 2015, and it was a huge victory for UNAM, because our conference was, and also until today has been, the only Metropolis conference that took place in a developed country. Most of the conference, all of them, even the ones that were organized after ours, has taken place in highly developed countries. The one this year will take place in The Hague, and the last year took place in Japan. So this is the reason why I wanted to stress the situation, but we are also focusing on security. We have a team of scholars who are observing what is happening in terms of the NAFTA debate. I mentioned how relevant it is, soft power and literature and cinema, but also we have a colleague that has devoted her life in terms of studying the literature of Chicana women. And she's a linguist. She's a linguistic. Linguistic is the discipline. Yeah. Sorry. And well, we are also focusing on asylum policy. We have been able to incorporate very young scholars. She's the youngest. One is doing another research that is also related to migration, but with a very different approach, because she began studying social corporate responsibility of the pharmaceutical companies linked with health in migration. This is a quite innovative research. And what else? You have to help me, because I'm running out of voice.
Excuse me, who is doing this research on social responsibility?
Corporate social responsibility, which is kind of a Valeria Marina.
Oh.
She used to work for the Tecnológico de Monterrey, and she moved. She's working with the... Oh yes, we are focusing on the financial sector, which is very relevant for North America, but also in the world. Unfortunately, one of our top scholars in migration that was focusing on labor markets in North America just retired. So this is we are beginning to experience a sort of a watershed, because nowadays there is very clearly two different generations. And we had an expert in NAFTA that was one of the top figures in Mexico, because she had been following the story and the history of NAFTA, Monica Gambrill, and the last book she published last year was precisely something regarded to the China and the maquiladora sector. She unfortunately passed away, so this institution needs to recuperate and recover some projects in order to continue to be very successful. Let me tell you that we have our own publishing department, and we publish not only the research findings of our experts, but we co-ed with different institutions. For example, we launched an initiative with one of the top think tanks of Europe, in terms of international relations. I don't know if you are familiar with it. It's the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and we had a joint publication with them, and we also have joint publications basically with the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I participate actively in the advisory board of the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson. And we also host experts such as you. All of you are so young, which I am very happy. But we invite people such as you, or sometimes younger, to spend some time with us. The university has launched a very strong initiative for welcoming postdoc students. Our postdoc can not only be nationals, but foreigners. Paola is now a researcher here because she was here a postdoc. I don't want to call them students. Postdoc students, I think it's bizarre for me.
Postdoc scholar.
Postdoc scholar. Yeah, absolutely. And I invite you all to think about the possibility of being with us as visiting scholars. I mentioned our publications, but I didn't mention this one, which I'm going to ask you to think about it and probably participate and collaborate with us in any of these two magazines. This is the North American one. This is also online. And this is basically a sort of de divulgación, de difusión, short articles, very well prepared, done by experts, but in a sort of a journalistic, expressing, more simple words. And so we invite you to publish in any or in both of them. This is a magazine that for the university is very relevant. Do not bother if it's called Voices of Mexico, because many people think when they see Voices of Mexico that this magazine is in English, but it is for Mexican voices to be presented in English. No, that's not the case. This magazine has won 2 or 3 times an award from the Mexican Publishers Association as the best magazine in its sort, published in Mexico in English. So I invite you to take a look and collaborate in any of them. We have a commitment to education, which is it's also very relevant to recognize, because the university has 3 tracks, and every one of us that is working within this university, we need to devote part of our time for focusing in each one of these 3 tracks. One is research. Of course, if you are here and you have won a position as researcher, you have to devote 70% of your time to do research, 20% of your time to do your teaching in any faculty or college or within the UNAM, because here we do not have students. This is a research unit, and we do have them if, for example, they are working with us and we are their mentors or advisors in their thesis. Yes? But each one of us has, my English is messy sometimes, very messy. Each one of us have our teaching duties in different schools. For example, I teach at the School of Political Science in the International Relations program. And some of my colleagues who are economists, and they are working in NAFTA, for example, they are giving their lectures in the Faculty of Economia, or the ones who participate, the ones who basically are doing cultural studies, guess where they are? Basically in the School of Philosophy and Literature. So this is the possibility that we have as a center to have a very ambitious outreach to different communities of students, because we are not allocated in only one faculty. You know what I mean? And the third, I was mentioning 70%, 20% teaching duties or advisory duties, and 10% is divulgación. So we have to be very active in the mass media. We used to get requests from not only national media but foreign media, especially nowadays, not only because of NAFTA but because of the Trump factor. And we also developed TV series for UNAM, because UNAM, we are so fortunate that UNAM we have our own TV channel and our own radio channel. So if you see, we belong to the most privileged in terms of the recognition that not only the Mexican people but the whole world has in terms of UNAM. We are very proud of being members and inhabited this amazing place that is called UNAM, and we welcome you to come back and do not pay a lot of attention about all these warnings of the State Department. I was reviewing them last Saturday, and it really gives me the creeps. I was really surprised about the dimension of the warnings in terms of even places such as Aguascalientes and so on. But that's another story.
The ACLU has issued warnings for travel to Texas right now with that governor there. So
Yeah?
so it's too many warnings.
Oh, but at least, you know, I try to serve that webpage because it's very relevant for us. And I found that it's growing and growing in numbers. And, well, but this is the reason why the Trump factor is giving us the opportunity to have you here. And we have been getting all these requests for hosting younger students. When I said younger, it's because, for example, a group of students from Texas A&M, they were doing their bachelor's, they come here, they want to listen not only to what CISAN is doing, but basically about what basically about our perspectives, what is the future of the U.S.-Mexico relation, and what would be the role of North America as a whole. So this institution is alive and kicking, and the red carpet is always ready for you all.
Thank you.
So if you have any questions. No?
Very wide
Not
and
yet. Any
complete.
comments?
Even
Very
we that
comfortable.
live in Mexico, we didn't know everything about CISAN and all what you do. So thank you, Sylvia.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And, I didn't mention something that is quite relevant also, because I will let you do your thing. The university also has, I don't know how to call them. We call them escuelas de extensión, but in English, yeah, but it's not properly, because if we use the word school, they are going to think that we have students. So this is the reason why we cannot translate, you know, ¿cómo se dice? Traducción literal, it's not possible. But branches, let me just put it like that. It's an institution, a small institution that represents UNAM in many different parts of the United States. This is the reason why, Miguel Angel, I saw you in Chicago. One is one of these spots, which is very relevant. It's not a campus. It's not a campus. No. They do different.
Centros.
Sí, pero en inglés there's no extension centers. It's very different. I mean, it's an office of representation. It's a sort of a consulate. That would be a cultural consulate. UNAM is
Cultural Center of UNAM.
so we do different initiatives in Chicago. Well, let me tell you where we are. Chicago, San Antonio, Tucson, Seattle, and Los Angeles. One in Gatineau, the French side of the river of Ottawa. Don't ask me why, but it was the French Canadians, the ones that said this is a window of opportunity. Let us host UNAM. Okay, in Gatineau, and what our branches in North America are trying to do, of course, is paying attention to all these issues that are gravitating in the regional agenda, such as migration, NAFTA, but also to work with the Mexican consulate to provide a hub, being very close to our diasporas in the United States, not only the undocumented, but the highly qualified. And this has been a very good opportunity for the center, because I believe that we are one of the more active institutions from UNAM that is sharing different projects with our branches in North America. But UNAM has not only stopped there. We have the same structure in London at King's College, in Madrid, in China, in Costa Rica, and pretty soon we will open another one in Berlin. Yes, and in France we also have one. And in Central and South America, just in Costa Rica. But this is the way UNAM is also paving the way in order to strengthen our, these words of current times, internationalization. That's so different, internationalization project. We know that most universities in the world are pursuing this as a keystone. But the difference, the big difference, is that, and this is very important for you to keep in mind, this institution is a non-profit institution. We are not going outside the world to sell and to have clients. This is, for me, the most valuable factor of our institution, because we will defend the right for all students to have access to higher education. This institution has a history of promoting upper social mobility in Mexico. And this is the reason why we call it La Universidad Nacional, La Universidad de la Nación. Where do we get our funding from? It's not the federal government. It's the Mexican people. Everyone that pays taxes, not only the affluent, but every single one that pays. And sometimes when you buy something, whether you have very little money or no money at all, you are paying a certain amount of taxes. So our responsibility here as professors, as researchers, is to give back to the Mexican people what we have been giving, what they have been giving to us in order to accomplish our very, very relevant social mission. This is what I wanted to stop my comments.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Enjoy. Hope to see you. Bueno, aquí hay unas tarjetas, si las quieren pasar, por favor. Sí, por favor. Si las quieren pasar. Y les voy a mandar unas revistas para que se las puedan llevar. Las dos están en línea, pero por si acaso y la tormenta solar llegase muy pronto, esto por ahí puede continuar.
Creo que acá está la queda.
Ah, ya los tienen, ya les dieron bolsitas. Ah, bueno. Very efficient. Bueno, fíjense. No, no.
Están aquí.
No, son para ti. Sí, claro. Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Me da mucho gusto darle la bienvenida a una colega también de la Facultad de Economía. Por favor, preséntate. ¿Vas a participar con
Sí,
ella?
principalmente como oyente.
Ah, bueno.
Como oyente, sí. También Laura también está trabajando cosas de educación. Ella
pues
sobre
sí.
todo trabaja vasculatura de cerebro y
Perdón, ¿cuál es su nombre?
Laura Vázquez, soy profesora en la Facultad de Economía y trabajo el tema de migración calificada principalmente. Y entonces, como Paola distribuyó la información de este evento en la red de Participamos en Migración, entonces por eso quise venir.
Muy bien, gracias.
Bueno, pues, jóvenes.
Muchísimas gracias, Silvia, y bueno, pues vamos a mantenerte al tanto de esa
Gracias,
reunión
Paola.
que va a
Felicidades en el
empezar.
Thank you.
Hasta luego. Por favor, se puede sentar acá, ¿eh?
Gracias.
Gracias.
Nos vemos, Silvia.
¿Traes tarjeta?
Te lo dejo con Paola. Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Well, thank you. So we're going to start now the session to discuss your papers in fact. So we have here in the program first Shannon. So I don't know if you can see right here or you need to. Yeah, okay. So Shannon, she's coming from Cornell University. She's associate professor and she's going to present towards a transformative platform for immigrant worker advocacy. So thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to everyone for being here. I know classes are not in session and it's the summer and you may have other places you'd rather be. I am going to do a bit of an overview of some of the political and third sector context of immigrant rights advocacy in the United States from the perspective of immigrant labor. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and where I come from on these issues. I'm trained as a sociologist and demographer, and a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past has focused on the experience of low-wage workers who are attempting to mobilize their rights through legal claims in the United States. I've also worked on a broad-scale, multi-sided project with my colleague Els, looking at the implementation of federal policies through the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program back in the U.S., as well as with another colleague who's not present, SOFYA, looking at the role of the consulate and the consular network. More recently, I've also been working some on the experience of workers who have the BSN, temporary protected status. And overall, what kind of unites my projects is my own interest in labor precarity and the role that immigrant status plays in shaping that precarity, how immigrants are able to mobilize their rights under the law, and especially the role that the third sector or nonprofit world has in helping broker that relationship. So what I wanted to do today I'm going to proceed in 4 parts from that perspective. One, I wanted to start by just setting a bit of the context of immigrant and especially undocumented labor in the United States, and say a little bit about both labor policy, labor and employment law, as well as the current deportation policies that we've had leading up to the current president's administration, and thinking about what's new. I then want to shift to thinking about the centerpiece of my talk, which is going to be focusing on the role that organized labor plays, so labor unions in the United States, and to think from a critical lens the role that they have played and the role that they are currently playing, especially vis-a-vis the president's policies. And I want to talk about what implications that has for social scientists who are setting a research agenda around the role of social movements and labor policy, and then also thinking about how we might conceptualize worker advocacy beyond these often narrow economic frames of justice. And so I'm going to move through that, and I have, how much time left?
We have 20 minutes.
Sure.
So
Okay.
right now is,
Okay.
you start that. We have 1:45.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to try to move through this rather quickly, but just assuming that not everyone is well acquainted with policies in the United States, just to give you a bit of an overview. About 16% of the private sector is foreign-born, and within that, a fairly large percent of that population is undocumented. Now, much of the focus often tends to be on this population, but I just want to highlight that undocumented workers, even though they form a rather significant part of the overall population, and even a larger percent of certain industries like agriculture, construction, hospitality, they're a bit of a, what I might call a canary in the coal mine for how we understand the precarity of low-wage workers overall, including the native-born. The experiences of immigrant workers tend to be characterized by poor working conditions, high rates of what we call workplace violations, occupational health issues, as well as very low rates of unionization. The current private sector unionization rate is about 7%, but it's even lower for immigrant and especially undocumented populations. So just to say a little bit more about the policy shaping the experience of undocumented workers. This is a slide that I've used in a lot of my presentations, but I think it's worth enforcing that from the perspective of the federal government, even under the current presidential administration, the federal government has a paradoxical, kind of a two-faced relationship with undocumented workers. On the one hand, they are a site of surveillance. The work site has become increasingly a mechanism for enhancing deportation policies. And so from one perspective, and from the perspective of several agencies, they are deportable aliens. On the other, using the term of the government, on the other hand, the federal government sees them as protected workers. And so several of our federal agencies, and especially our state and local agencies, see them as not only a vital part of economic development, but also a key outreach target, partly because the understanding is that the ability for any agency to hold an employer accountable to compliance mechanisms rests on their ability to protect the most vulnerable. And so even after some major challenges that rose to the level of the Supreme Court, these agencies have remained very active in focusing their outreach efforts on the Latino community as a whole, but undocumented workers in particular, through oftentimes intermediaries such as the Mexican consulate, but also an array of nonprofit organizations that provide legal access. And the reason this becomes relevant is that there's a number of enforcement challenges that these agencies face, right? So if we're just thinking now from the perspective of the government, enforcing labor and employment law in the United States, as in any country, including Mexico, is difficult because there's not only gaps in the coverage of the law, the informal economy, for example, becomes problematic. Our system relies on claims-driven investigation, so an investigation doesn't tend to be launched unless a worker comes forward to mobilize that claim. There's woefully insufficient resources for enforcement. While we've been spending a lot of time and energy focusing on the border buildup, we've seen an increasingly narrowing level of funding and support for labor investigations. Right now, it's about 2 years if you file a claim before you see it resolved. So oftentimes you see the statute of limitations expire before a claim actually comes to the fore. And at the end of the day, these laws are, for an employer, just the cost of doing business. The risk, they're very, employers are generally risk averse, but this is one area where many will take the risk of violating these laws because they've become kind of an industry standard to engage in wage theft and all the rest. So immigrants represent a category more broadly of marginal workers who, as I mentioned, become an interesting site of investigation for understanding the challenges that they face. So I wanted to kind of shift to thinking about the undocumented population as a whole, and just to highlight that even though much of the discourse has been focused on the Trump administration, pre-Trump the stakes were fairly high. And much of what we see the current president engaging in, the foundation was laid very cleanly for him with the three previous administrations in particular. Currently, we have on something on the order of 11 million undocumented. That includes about 8 million who are in the labor force. But if we think more broadly, we're looking at about over 16 million who exist in mixed status families. So those are families who might have U.S.-born children or other family members who may have an undocumented person in that family. Undocumented workers are amongst the most vulnerable, but that vulnerability impacts not only that wage earner, but also the families that rest within that household who rely on them. Now, the Obama administration was very effective in ramping up an immigration enforcement apparatus. At present, Congress funds, and we'll see that changing, but funds up to about 400,000 removals a year. As you may have heard, the Obama administration had the kind of title deporter-in-chief, and that's one that even many progressives were uncomfortable attributing to him, but which the facts bear out. A subset of the deportable population are in detention, and you've also probably heard quite a bit of discussions about the conditions of those who are in detention. But if we look at just the removals of those populations, and I'm talking about this just so that we can understand the context in which I'm going to then shift to thinking about labor unions, kind of what is the context for that population. So if we look at the data from Immigration Customs Enforcement, we see an important kind of breakdown between who are the criminal and quote-unquote non-criminal removals. Much of the rhetoric around deportation has been focused even during the priorities set by the Obama administration on quote-unquote criminal aliens. But in fact, we know that the vast majority, or the good chunk of those who were removed, so those are the non-criminal immigration violators, the blue, don't fall into the criminal category, but in fact their only crime was crossing the border or overstaying their visa. A much smaller percent, especially early on, although that changed so much, involved convicted criminals. But as I'm going to talk about in a bit, the ways in which we think about convicted criminals really are important to tie to some of the other policies of policing in the United States, which affect communities of color. So this is Obama. This is not Trump. And we also know that if we look at the conviction types, so even if we're just focusing on the population who have quote-unquote criminal histories, only a very small percent, about 1 in 5, have violent or potentially violent convictions. The vast majority of the rest of them either have no conviction or an immigration conviction or a non-violent conviction, many of them being drug offenses. So I frame this as the way in which we think about social justice, even as it relates to immigrant workers, is much more complex than the way we're going to hear about the framings in a bit. So the result of these policies has been a historical ramp-up in deportation. Our colleague Tanya Golashgoza has done quite a bit of work on this, and we can see that historically that ramp-up is at high levels. The current numbers, as I mentioned before, sit at about 4.2 million deportations since the mid-90s, when a lot of the policies that allow for state and local cooperation were put into effect. About 98% of those deportees, as she finds, are from Latin America, even though only 75% of the deportable population is from the region. And we know that this is an overwhelmingly gendered population, about 8% are men. So that's the state of deportation pre-Trump. So we've been in this situation for quite a while. So what is different now? Now, certainly the current population of individuals who are at risk hasn't changed much, but the policies and the communities who have advocated around them have certainly broadened the set of discussions happening. So just to give you a few kind of current events of what the Trump administration has argued for, we've heard about the Muslim ban. There's lots of talk of growing the capacity to aid in funding immigration enforcement, a complete deprioritization of deportation targets, including most recently parents of U.S. citizen and legal permanent resident children. A lot of effort now to revive local coordination, especially through things like the 287G program. Obama had removed the role of private prisons in immigration enforcement. Trump has kind of rekindled those back deal and front door relationships. Important also for labor rights has been the elimination, a push to eliminate the Legal Services Corporation, which is a federally funded effort to provide legal counsel to individuals. And then a number of other things, which I won't go into, but which affect us as universities, including questions of enforcement and what are considered safe spaces. So on our campus and then some of my colleagues' campuses, lots of conversations about what role universities will play in facilitating immigration enforcement or keeping them away. And for us as researchers, also many concerns around the funding that would go to research efforts like ours. And Els and I collaborated, and we talked a lot about kind of how do we protect our data, which is largely with immigrant organizations, but in my case also immigrant workers. How do we protect that data, especially when they're traveling, crossing the border? And we have an RA who is traveling as well and kind of thinking through what that means for them. So that's the current context for those of us who are doing research. So now I want to insert in this the role of labor unions. As I mentioned, the role of labor unions in the United States has changed quite a bit over the years. But currently we tend to think of labor unions as having a fairly pro-immigrant stance, particularly in what we would call high immigrant industries, like agriculture, food service, construction, etc. But if we look back, the labor union community has had a quite storied past. If we look to the early consolidation of the American Federation of Labor, they are often cited by restrictionist or anti-immigrant groups as being very focused on limiting migration. Even Cesar Chavez, who I should mention whenever I ask in my class who is Cesar Chavez, 1 or 2 hands go up. But those who do know Cesar Chavez know him as an immigrant rights pioneer, but even in his early years, his posture towards undocumented immigrants was much more restrictionist, and it really wasn't until the Chicano student movement that he changed his approach. In the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, was instituted what are called employer sanctions, which penalize employers for hiring undocumented workers. Unions were right at the front of promoting those policies, and they have only really shifted their perspective in the last 15 years. And so what I want to think about is that shift that happened in 2000, what has the effect been, and how can we think about labor unions, even though they have a very small membership, they still have a very influential role as policy advocates in Washington, D.C., and also at the state level in many places where they still have power, like California. In 2017, right after the inauguration, Rich Trumka, who is the head of the AFL-CIO, paid a visit to the White House and sat down with President Trump and the National Building Trades, which I'll show you some excerpts from. I have also had a very close relationship. So for those who are on the ground in immigrant communities looking at the AFL-CIO, there's a bit of a conflicted relationship. On the one hand, from a perspective of economic justice, labor unions have crafted a policy agenda that looks very much in favor of creating policies that support working families. And especially for immigrant unions, like the UFW, the UFCW, the SEIU, and others, there's a sense that unions are allies of the immigrant rights movement. On the other hand, you see politics of the national deals being brokered. And so why do we care about this? So we care about this because as any other third sector organization, labor unions have a number of different factors that really shape their ability to engage in advocacy that is meaningful to their membership. They often execute policies at the national level that don't necessarily closely align with what's happening at the local level. Some industries, as we'll see in a bit, are much more pro-immigrant than others. And the issues that are considered to be immigrant issues are often gendered, and certainly we see that the issues of reproductive justice and other elements that matter, for example, to working women aren't necessarily adopted. And what we see often is an embrace of the labor function of low-wage workers being promoted by labor unions. So we see on the left here, this is a sign by UFCW, the United Food and Commercial Workers, who represent food processing and food retail stores, very much in favor of immigration reform, and this has been a platform for a long time, but on the basis of economic utility. We also see very commonly a focus on hard work, economic benefit, fiscal sense. But in this way, we see a very narrowing posture towards the needs of immigrants and their families. There are certainly some immigrant unions that have broadened that perspective, but as a whole, we don't see the same kind of focus on the issues facing workers. So I want to skip a little bit here and just focus on the national leadership. A bit of the timeline here. In January, as I mentioned, the AFL-CIO represented leadership met with Trump at Trump Tower. You see some pictures of that here on the left. We also see later that month Trump meeting with labor unions, also to talk about a lot of free trade agreements that would favor unions like pulling out of the TPP on the one hand, but also being very pro-pipeline through the Keystone region. And then what you see, though, what I want to highlight is that there's a tension between what's happening with the national leadership and the membership itself. And so in April, the North American Building Trades Unions, which has had the motto of they are for a border wall as long as it's union made, has had to contend with, especially in diverse areas, the membership pushing back. So what you see here on the right is Trump. Trump is talking in the background. Those are the national labor leaders who invited him to come and talk at the Building Trades Conference. And what you see in the foreground are members from a local IBEW, the electrical workers in Southern California, engaging in their resistance. And so the question is, to what extent will that resistance be embraced by the national leadership? And so why do I think that this is important for us as scholars, and what does this mean for how we think about moving forward? This is, I think, an issue for the AFL-CIO in terms of how they craft a message that appeals to something other than older white men who tend to be the leadership of unions. It also means has implications for who unions will end up working in collaboration with. The AFL-CIO has been very supportive of many of the student movements, like United We Dream, but many other social justice movements have steered clear of unions because of their very storied politics. And meeting with Trump doesn't help that. And so how we think about strategizing for political power, I think it's an open question whether or not unions will be at the head of that effort moving forward. And I have a feeling that the recent months have led unions to lose more legitimacy than they probably had in the decades past. And so I think for us as researchers moving forward, I think this workshop right here represents an example of kind of the need for transnational perspectives, and how do we think about union labor unions as a social movement. The U.S. labor movement is very, in some ways, unique and exceptional. If we look at the positions that they have taken here in Mexico, if we also see what's happening throughout the Latin American region, the radicalization and even unionization here has, I think, some lessons to share with their neighbors to the north. And I think that what we'll see is a shift towards thinking about a much more critical perspective on unions and a full circle back to where we see their efforts in organizing, especially as specific states make it harder for unions to engage in campaigns. And so I just want to put that out as a kind of a frame for our discussion and how social movements are reacting to the current presidency. And I think ultimately what we're going to see is state and local efforts leading the charge while the national leadership spends its time in DC brokering deals inside the White House. So I look forward to your perspective, but that's a bit of the work that we've been doing, trying to understand the role of unions. Thank you.
Just brief.
So the comments and everything at the end
Okay.
is not where we don't have enough time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much,
Yeah.
Shannon. And our next panelist is Elsa Rowe. And she's coming from City University of New York. And she's working right now with City Immigrant Affairs Offices in the United States, taking local control of immigrant integration.
I know it's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's like immigrant integration.
Yeah.
So she's coming also from political science department, right?
Yes. So
Baruch
College.
College.
Yeah. So Baruch College is part of the City University of New York system. It's the largest urban college system in the United States. Has about 22 campuses across the city. A little bit of background about me. I was born and raised in the Netherlands. Did my undergraduate degree in the Netherlands in American Studies. At the time, wrote a master thesis on the border maquiladoras, and then thinking I was going to pursue a graduate degree looking at international affairs, West European politics, and U.S. politics, and I, along the way, really got interested in local politics in the context of the United States. As a grad student, I did research looking at the role of nonprofit organizations in advocating for immigrant rights policies at the local level in the United States. And did a lot of interviews with government officials, what we call 501c3 nonprofits, the folks that are incorporated as not-for-profit, and they're limited in the amount of advocacy that they can do because of their tax-exempt status. So I was trying to figure out how do they do what they do given all the limitations that they have. And that research is now completed, but it really opened up doors for other projects. As Shannon mentioned, we are working on a big project that looks at the local implementation of this DACA program. Are you guys all familiar with DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals? And we look at that in a couple of different cities, including New York, Houston, and the Bay Area. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project I'm working on now. So I teach in the political science department, but I also teach in our public policy school, so I have kind of two hats. I do a lot of work on cities, public policy, how cities work with nonprofit organizations, including foundations, and how public-private partnerships are formed to better serve and to better represent immigrant communities in cities, and also the institution building that they do to kind of amplify immigrant voice in local politics and policy making. So I'm working on a new book project that is a comparative study of city and state immigrant affairs offices in the United States, and in the last, I want to say, 10, 14 years, we've seen a growing number of these offices being created all across the United States.
New York City was one of the first to create one in the mid-1980s, and it was kind of leading the pack together with Boston, two cities that have a long history of welcoming immigrants, but it's now much more common. So with this project, I seek to answer why government officials, city government officials, have established these offices, what these offices are doing, and also the effect that they have on immigrant communities. I also look at how these offices work with civil society organizations, and then what these public-private partnerships, what they look like in the context of immigrant integration. Now, city and state immigrant affairs offices are created by mayors and governors, so executive leadership. So I'm also interested in looking at how these executive level initiatives, how they work with legislative officials, right? Imagine city council members who want to make a name for themselves as representing the immigrant community. What happens if now you have a mayor or at the state level a governor who also wants to be known as a progressive voice on these issues? Do they work together? Is there tension? How is that addressed? I also, because I look at both city and state offices, I also look at how city offices, how they interact with the state equivalents. If they are present, so in New York we have a city office and a state office. There's only 5 state offices, so there's not that many, but they're growing. I also do work in Detroit, and Michigan also has a state office, so it's kind of interesting to see that dynamic, so kind of federalist relations, how they kind of speak in here. And also I'm investigating how differences in city context, for example, what is the city's history with immigration? What are the political dynamics in the city? Is it more democratic? Is it more politically contested? How the characteristics of local immigrant communities. New York has a super diverse immigrant population. I also do work in Houston, which is a very noticeable, large Latino immigrant population. I also do work in San Francisco, which has a large Asian immigrant population. How do these kind of characteristics affect what these offices do? And I also look at the characteristics of the nonprofit sector, the local nonprofit sector. How does it impact what these offices do and how they go about their work? To answer the questions that I just kind of highlighted for you, I'm doing a couple of different things. I just want to give you a flavor of kind of the research that I do. I'm happy to go into more detail later on. But one of the first things I did was create a national database of all city and state immigrant affairs offices in the country. And it sounds like a straightforward thing to do, but they're all called something different. And you can see some of the names here, and sometimes they're kind of hidden on like city government websites. So it took us quite a bit of time to figure out how many are there and where are they. Once I figured that out, I'm also interviewing the directors of all these offices. So doing kind of like a survey of when they were created, what are they doing, all that kind of good stuff. On top of that, I'm also conducting in-depth case studies of immigrant affairs offices in 5 large cities that have different histories of immigration, that have different political dynamics, that have different immigrant communities, but also have notably different local economies, and also have different infrastructures of civil society organizations. So these cities, you see them listed here, are New York, where I live and work, Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, San Francisco in California, and then Detroit, Michigan, which is a case on its own, but very interesting. So given that these cities offer such different kind of contexts, I'm able to analyze how local context affects kind of local institutional responses to immigrant integration. So as part of all these case studies, I'm interviewing a broad range of stakeholders. So I interview state and local government officials, both appointed and elected. I'm also interviewing the leaders of a range of immigrant-serving nonprofit organizations, so my prior research here comes in handy. But I also talk to representatives of local foundations who are often investing resources in this kind of institution building. Labor unions, so I've learned quite a few things from Shannon, the business community, and also foreign consulates, particularly the Mexican consulate is active in different places. So this research is still very much in progress, and I don't have yet kind of like a coherent story to share with you particularly about how local context affects these kind of institutional dynamics around immigrant integration. So what I'd like to do in the remainder of the time that I have is just to give you an overview of what I've learned about these offices and to give you a flavor of where I'm going with this. A couple of things that I want to cover. So as I mentioned, we've seen a growth or an expansion in the number of these offices since about 2000, 2001. So why are we seeing this now, right? Why is this like a current thing, even though the US has long had spurts of immigration? How many of these offices are there? Where can we find them? What do they do? I also want to highlight two themes that I'm kind of pursuing. One is a theme around leadership, particularly the leadership of mayors and governors, but also the folks who run these offices, so the directors of these offices. And then I want to say a few things about collaborations, particularly with the nonprofit sector, so public-private partnerships. So I first want to briefly talk about why we have seen a growth and an expansion in the number of these. I'm going to here just focus on city immigrant affairs offices. I'll leave the state offices aside for now. So again, the growth was notable since 2000. So one reason I think is that we've experienced some pretty noticeable and dramatic demographic changes nationwide, particularly after immigration law was liberalized in 1965. Between the 1920s and 1960s, there were federal laws on the book that basically shut the door on noticeable groups of immigrants, particularly those from Southeast Europe, but also those from particular Asian countries. So that changed in '65. And it, if you look at the immigration numbers, I should have shown you like a bar graph, but the largest number of immigrants came in the 1990s and 2000s. There's a steep rise, and I think local governments are now catching up with that reality, and they're creating institutions that can both address the challenges, but they can also leverage the opportunities of a growing immigrant population. Another reason is the continued lack of federal attention to immigrant integration, and also the absence of a national or coherent integration program. As Shannon already kind of signaled, the emphasis today is really on enforcement at the federal level and not so much integration. The federal government does issue some grants to promote naturalization, but it's, in my mind, just a drop in the bucket. There's much more that needs to be done. There's not a whole lot that's being done around language access or labor rights or other kinds of issues that immigrants in particular struggle with. So I think of these city immigrant affairs offices as entities that are stepping into that void that the federal government has created, and they're creating their own institutions and their own policies as best they can within this federal framework, right? And it's quite contested. Sometimes they do things where the federal government goes like, maybe that is our policy domain, and they're being challenged. So I can go into more about it, particularly as it relates to sanctuary policies, but also municipal ID cards. So some cities are now issuing their own ID cards, also to give a form of ID to the undocumented populations in those cities. And the federal government is saying, you're basically recognizing them as legal residents of the United States. It doesn't match well with our policy, so it's been kind of interesting. And a final reason why we've seen a growth in these number of city immigrant affairs offices is because there is now wider availability of technical assistance and support from key organizations and key coalitions that help city officials when city officials want to develop institutions and programs that address immigrant integration. So examples of these are all kind of, most of these are nonprofit organizations. Some of these organizations that do work nationally, and I think they do very kind of interesting and groundbreaking work. Welcoming America, which is located just outside of Atlanta in Decatur. They really try to get cities on board with creating more welcoming communities. Cities for Action, which is really local government officials, particularly mayors, banding together. The We Global Network is kind of located in the northeast of the United States, really getting the Rust Belt region behind a more inclusive agenda. GSER is Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. They're located in California, but they work with foundations to get foundations more excited about investing in immigration, integration issues. And given, recent developments, there's been a chill, I think, in the foundation world, particularly after DACA II and DAPA were halted in the courts. And then the National Immigrant Integration Conference, which meets nationally and brings together policymakers at the state and local level, practitioners, and a sprinkling of academics that do work on this issue. So how many of these offices are there? I mentioned before that I've created a national database, what I basically did, I looked at all the states to see what they have, and I also looked at all cities with populations over 100,000 to see what kind of institutions they have. I used a broad range of search terms to capture these institutions. So all in all, I found 44 formalized immigrant affairs offices in 41 different cities. Some cities have multiple offices, sometimes dedicated to Latino issues and African American or African Caribbean issues and even Asian issues. I also found over 90 other, and these are less formalized types of municipal bodies and programs that are focused on immigrant communities. So these included task forces, boards, commissions. Again, they're less institutionalized, but they do very similar work. So where could they be found? They can be found all over the United States, which I think is why it's such an interesting development. They are more prevalent still in the larger cities that have more resources to create and then to staff these offices. But the largest and the most formalized of these offices can be found in what are considered traditional and long-established immigrant destinations. So here you need to think of New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Boston. We can also find them in Rust Belt cities, so cities that have gone through significant deindustrialization and population loss. Buffalo, Detroit, Philadelphia, for example. And here city officials view these offices as yet another tool that they can use to attract immigrants to repopulate their cities and to try to revitalize their economies. Particularly Detroit is a very strong message. And then they can also be found in what are called new southern gateway cities. So southern cities that are fairly new to mass migration. Atlanta comes to mind, for example, but also Tennessee. And here city officials have mentioned the importance of these offices in helping to diffuse tensions and to temper local hostilities between immigrants and native-born residents, particularly native-born blacks. So the race issue is kind of noticeable there. Briefly, what did they do? Given that there's such a variety of offices, there's also quite a variety in what they do, really kind of bringing home the idea that integration is locally flavored. There's not one size fits all. So, but I'll tell you a little bit about what they have in common. So, all these offices seek to welcome immigrants and refugees, and they also try to seek to change the public discourse on immigration. So you got the negative discourse at the federal level. We want a more welcoming and inclusive discourse at the local level, right? They also emphasize that immigrants and refugees are important for the economic vitality of cities, but also for the larger metro regions that these cities are part of. They also seek to coordinate and streamline city services. So these offices themselves often don't provide services, but they try to coordinate so all the departments have a unified response and that they're kind of on the same page about what needs to be done when it comes to serving and advocating for immigrant communities locally. Many offices also put on initiatives that seek to encourage immigrant civic engagement and leadership development. So let's develop new leaders in our immigrant communities so that they can then advocate for themselves, right? Some offices even issue grants and funding to make those things happen. And then finally, city immigrant affairs offices develop and are involved with implementing local laws or local policies that promote immigrant integration and that protect immigrant rights. So quite a few cities have now language access policies on the book where cities are kind of expected to provide information and services in language other than English, right? I already mentioned local ID cards and the DACA implementation of the legal immigration services. I have 2 more slides, so I hope that's okay. In my research, as I mentioned, also explore a couple of different themes. One of them is, and I think that variation in local context has different things to say about these themes. So one of them is leadership. As I already mentioned, the leadership of mayors is critically important here. And as I mentioned before, city immigrant affairs offices have been set up under the auspices of the mayor, so any kind of executive branch of local government. Mayors determine how much power these entities have, how much resources they get, and what responsibilities they have. And mayors also play an important role in kind of protecting the institution if there's criticism from the outside, and also institutionalizing it so that it will stay around if a new mayor is elected, right? And that's kind of a struggle right now that a lot of these offices are going through because they are new. So how are they dealing with a leadership transition? It's interesting to note here that mayors in different cities have different political and different economic and different moral motivations to support these offices. So the mayor in Houston, Mayor Brown, who by the way is African American, he created the office in Houston in 2001. It was one of the earlier ones, and I interviewed him, and he was quite unapologetic, and he said, you know, I wanted this office to be created for electoral considerations. I'm an African American mayor. We have a growing Latino immigrant, you know, voting population. I want to be able to appeal to them. I don't think he was all that successful, but that was his thinking going in. The mayor in Atlanta, Kasim Reed, who's also black, he brought, when I talked to his staff, he really talked about the city's focal role in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and he emphasized how the Immigrant Affairs Office, which was created about 2 years ago, is really important in honoring the city's civil rights legacy. And they really see, you know, serving immigrant communities as the next kind of civil rights battle for that city. So it kind of fits with local legacies. And then in Detroit, Mayor Mike Duggan, who is white, he emphasized how a city Immigrant Affairs Office better positions the city to harness and to stimulate immigrants' economic contributions. You know, if you know, Detroit has been suffering with deindustrialization and bankruptcy, and they look to immigrants as a solution to that. Besides mayors, very quickly, office directors, so the folks who run these offices on a day-to-day basis are also very important. They have the ability to maximize limited resources, to marshal support, public support, to convene relevant stakeholders, and also to leverage the limited opportunities that they have to affect policy change. Now, some office directors are much more progressive on these issues than others, and their prior career backgrounds matter significantly in how they go about their work. A lot of the directors have backgrounds in law and community organizing, and they're on the more active, proactive, progressive front, but there's some that have backgrounds in business, or maybe are career local politicians with not a whole lot of expertise in immigrant integration issues. And those discussions about integration then take a very different turn. Finally, and I'll be very brief here, I want to talk a little bit about collaborations and public-private partnerships between these offices and nonprofit organizations. For the most part, these city immigrant affairs offices have very limited resources. New York City is like the exception. In the last couple of years, the staff expanded from about 7 or 8 to 50 plus. It's very hard to actually figure out what their budget is, but they're very well resourced. In most other places, they have maybe a staff of 2 if they're lucky, and they might do this sometimes part-time while they do other work in local government. So they have limited resources, and many of them don't have programmatic budgets, meaning they have funding for staff and a copier and paper, but not funding to organize programs or to do events. So things are tough, and it's because of that collaborations with others is tremendously important for them to kind of amplify what they do. So they work with a broad range of local stakeholders, including community-based organizations. So immigrant rights organizations, you can imagine, are kind of key stakeholders for them. But also faith-based institutions, so local churches, foundations, more and more, chambers of commerce, local labor unions, local universities. They can provide some research capacity. And there's other stakeholders. So they also work with state officials and federal officials. And here there is variation across cities in the degree to which these collaborations are happening. So for example, in places where civil society is thin or fairly new, I'm thinking, for example, more Atlanta versus New York City, or even Houston versus New York City, this collaboration is still kind of new and it's still developing. And there's less of this happening. And I think a key role for these offices could be to invest in more capacity building, right? Don't quite see a lot of that happening, but yeah. There's also variation who city officials work with. For example, offices in Atlanta and Detroit, they maintain fairly close relations with the business community, but I don't see very much of that kind of collaboration in San Francisco, even though Silicon Valley is pretty much right next door and they've benefited a lot from immigrant workers and the immigrant labor force. So that's kind of interesting, right? And I think these variations in the collaborations that are happening have implications for immigrant integration, how it's talked about, what initiatives are pursued, and to what end. So I'm still kind of, working through this and getting a more analytical lens on it. But I wanted to leave it at this. I'm happy to share my slides if you wanted to see them. Just email me, and I look forward to questions and comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Els. And now we have the conference or the paper of SOFYA. She is from the University of Massachusetts.
Is there a bathroom?
Yeah, it's right here. The bathroom is right here. And nos vemos ahí, claro. Muchísimas gracias por venir. And the title of the conference is The Green Card Army, Immigrant Enlistment in the U.S. Military. So thank you, Sophia.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to share some of my preliminary findings from ongoing research. Just a little bit of background about me. I work at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So some of you may know Boston is a city with lots and lots of colleges and universities. I think we have 40. I work at the only public university in all of Boston. So we serve students who are working class, first-generation college students, immigrant students, and students of color. So my research, a strand of my research is about naturalization, immigrants in the United States acquiring citizenship. I have a recent book on the subject, and this most recent project comes out of that because I realized that one piece that I was missing is the naturalization of members of the military, which is kind of a unique process and unique situation that I wanted to examine in more depth. So what I'll do today is talk about, in particular, the enlistment in the military among immigrants signing up voluntarily to serve in the military, and how it works or doesn't work for them to get U.S. citizenship while they're in. Some basic numbers first. There are about 25,000 non-citizens serving in all of the 5 branches of the U.S. military. There are about 5,000 non-citizens who enlist every year. That's in the last 10 years or so. And if we look at all veterans in the United States, so anybody who has served in the U.S. military at any time who's still alive, there are over 500,000 who were born outside of the United States. So that's a lot of people. And while some of you may know that Latinos are overrepresented in the military, and they're overrepresented among those who die and who are injured while serving in the military, immigrants are actually underrepresented. So while Latinos as a whole are overrepresented, the immigrant component are underrepresented for a variety of reasons. So just to give you a sense of where people are coming from, so this is looking at all immigrant veterans in the United States who are alive today, and it's a pretty diverse group. So immigrants born in Mexico are generally the largest group of immigrants, period. They're not such a large group out of veterans. But Philippines are. So keeping that in mind, that's where American soldiers who are not born in the U.S. are coming from. So I'll talk about this first. So a lot of people are surprised that you can even join the U.S. military without having U.S. citizenship. A lot of times as I'm doing this research, people say, what are you talking about? How is that even possible? Even people in the military are often surprised and say, what kind of topic is this? This is impossible. But it's not only possible, but it has been happening since the birth of the American nation. There's always been immigrants and foreign-born individuals in the U.S. military. So you don't need to have citizenship to join the U.S. military. But once you enlist, once you join the military as an immigrant, you have a fast track to U.S. citizenship. So normally you have to wait 5 years as a green card holder or a permanent legal resident, or 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen. Once you join the military, if the United States is at war, which is a lot of times, it's been at war officially since 9/11 now, you are immediately eligible. So right away, you immigrated 2 weeks ago, you can go enlist in the military and you're going to be a citizen very soon after, technically, right? That is how the process is supposed to happen on paper, and a lot of my research is about how it actually does not happen that way. But maybe the people enlisted thinking that was what was going to happen. So you also don't have to pay the fees to naturalize when you're in the military, which are currently, even without paying an attorney, just the fees to file the application are almost $800, which is a lot of money for a lot of immigrants. In the military, you don't have to do that. So it's quick, it's cheap, and it's used to attract immigrants into the military. So since 2001, about 100,000 have acquired U.S. citizenship through this fast-track process. And what I also want to note is that it's important to remember that the military itself benefits from the immigrant soldiers getting citizenship. I forgot to start this time. I'll cut off 5 minutes. And that's, so the military benefits itself, because what happens if you have soldiers who don't have U.S. citizenship, they're actually very limited in the types of jobs they can have, because a lot of jobs in the military require security clearance. And you can't have security clearance if you don't have U.S. citizenship. So the military, to have the most efficient use of its labor force, wants to have everyone be citizens so they can reshuffle them and put them where they need to go and do the jobs that they need to do in the military. When you have immigrants who are not U.S. citizens, they're very limited in what type of job they can do and where they can go. Although, yes, they can serve in combat and they get killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not the limitation anymore. That's not the type of limitation, unfortunately, that they have. And so immigrant veterans who don't get U.S. citizenship, and there are currently more than 90,000 of them, are threatened with deportation. So even though they served in the military, and most of them are permanent legal residents, they have green cards, there's no special provisions for veterans in immigrant court procedures. So if they're convicted of an aggravated felony, for example, the definition of which varies very widely, and that actually relates to what Shannon was saying in terms of those percentages of who gets deported. Another thing to remember is that in the United States, the vast majority of people who are accused of a crime, they take a guilty plea. So they're pressured to say I'm guilty and not have a trial, because the alternative is, what if you go to trial and get 10 years? Just say you're guilty, and then you get a year or 6 months. So a lot of people do that, and they don't realize that that means that afterwards they face deportation. They're not told that. So at that point, they're deported to the country of their birth, or maybe the country of the birth of their parents, if they're refugees, because a lot of refugees are not being born in the country, they're born in refugee camps. And veterans as a whole are a population that are at risk for homelessness, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse. So they often come into contact with the criminal justice system, right? And then they get deported. So in this picture that I have up here, there's a group of deported veterans and their supporters who have this Deported Veterans Support House in Tijuana. They just opened the second one in Ciudad Juarez. And their organization started by one deported veteran to serve as advocates for deported veterans, not just in Mexico, but across the world. So people get in touch with them from Jamaica, India, all the other countries where people have been deported as veterans. Just to give you a little bit more context, some of these veterans are, amputees. They lost limbs in the wars. They're very disabled. They have all kinds of issues. And when they're deported, they're not able to access any of the benefits that veterans in the United States get, like health care, or any kind of payments for disability. So once they're deported, they're kind of out of that system and they can't access that system. And of course, I don't need to tell you that, but a lot of them are, grew up in the United States, maybe left Mexico when they were 1 or 2 years old, so they often speak Spanish, so there's all kinds of issues as well.
Sophia, just to clarify, these are folks who have legal permanent residence, but they're still deportable.
Right.
Because
So they're legal permanent residents, so they're not undocumented. Although I'll talk a little bit about how that could happen as well. It could be undocumented and so. Okay. Right, so U.S. citizenship is not required to join the military, but what's even more surprising is that technically you don't even have to be a permanent legal resident. Like legal scholars who look into that say that there is nothing legally that obliges us to only take permanent residence. Most people who enlist do have permanent legal residency, and that's because there's a policy by the branch of the military to do so. They don't have to do that. And in fact, that there is evidence that because there's a severe personnel shortage, fighting these really long, dragged-out wars where soldiers do die, people are not so eager to enlist, so there's a shortage. There is evidence that recruiters pressure and actively enlist undocumented people and give all kinds of promises, and then they mess with the paperwork enough that it's okay. So there's evidence of that. However, there's also an official program that's called Military Sessions of Vital National Importance, MOVNI, that Trump has suspended. So once the election happened, they actually immediately suspended it. But for the past 5 to 6 years or so, 5,000 foreigners would join the U.S. military without being residents. So you would go straight from what the United States classifies as non-immigrant, somebody with a student visa, somebody with a fiancé visa, temporary work visa, and you go straight to citizenship. You skip all the intermediate normal stages of the immigration process. So they recruit these folks, and usually it is people who have special skills of vital national importance. What are those? You can speak a language from a list of 23, like Mandarin Chinese, Farsi, so Spanish is not a language of national importance in the United States on that list, but a lot of languages are. So immigrants from those countries, or some of the student visa from that country, or could join the military that way. So technically, you don't have to have any immigration status. In the immigration reform movement, there's a campaign to allow undocumented youth, so the dreamers, to gain a U.S. Citizenship through military service. So I'll show you a picture. So advocates of and undocumented immigrants themselves are fighting to be allowed to enlist in the U.S. military to prove their patriotism, but also to get this path, to get a path to citizenship at some point. Currently, there's an act called the Enlist Act that's being considered by the U.S. Congress that would allow undocumented youth to join the U.S. military. So this is one of these groups that's under the American flag. It says, "Let us serve." So I give you a little bit of background, and I just want to give you a little bit of a preview of my research. I'm not going to go wide like Els did. I'm going to go deep, so I'm just going to focus on one thing out of many, and then if anyone is interested in other aspects, I can talk about it during Q&A. So I'm looking at the role of U.S. citizenship in enlistment of immigrants. So when people sign up to join the military, how does citizenship work? Are they thinking about it? Are they told about it? Are they, is this a tool of recruitment? How do they understand this whole process? And so far, I have 25 interviews that I've collected. 24 of these interviews are people who have enlisted before they got U.S. citizenship. And one interview with someone who's going through the process at the time. So I kind of got them in the middle of the process. And I recruited them through a variety of methods, through service providers to veterans, college veteran offices, legal clinics, health clinics, my personal networks, and also those people I interviewed in some cases, got their friends to talk to me, so small sample as well. So I began this work in June 2015. I'm still working on it. In this current political climate, it is very difficult to get people to talk to you about this, so it's very slow going. But I feel like at this point I can start talking about what it is I'm finding and seeing patterns. So there's just some characteristics of my respondents. You can see they came from 21 countries. I'm not trying to do this. It just happened. They're such a diverse group. So the largest group is from Mexico. But there's so many different countries that these people came from. They're mostly men. The median age was 35. I interviewed veterans from age 19 to 76. Most of them enlisted after 9/11, but I also had a good number of them enlisted in the 90s and a couple even before that. And most of them enlisted at the age of 21, so pretty young. They mostly served in the Army and the Navy. 20 of them naturalized while they were in the military, 3 naturalized after they left the military, and which leaves 2 who still don't have this signature. So I'm not talking to the deported veterans, that picture that I showed, although that's part of my research as well. I've spoken to them on the phone, and I think that will be an aspect of the research as well. At this point, though, I'm talking to the ones who haven't been deported, trying to figure out, how they went through the process, in some cases successfully. So those in the United States who opposed this Enlist Act, which would allow documented immigrants to enlist and get U.S. citizenship, they worry that there will be a green card mill. That means like there'll be a rush of all these undocumented people, joining the military just to get their citizenship, and that will just encourage more undocumented people to come to the United States. That's kind of the idea behind the opposition. And the U.S. is technically has an all-volunteer army, but many critics have pointed out that instead what we have is a power draft. And immigrants are enlisting for the same reasons, some of the same reasons that everybody in the United States enlists. Young people have few viable job or educational opportunities. Recruiters are all over high schools, like you're constantly hearing about it. I have respondents who said, no one from a college ever came to talk in my high school, but we have recruiters coming every week from every branch of the military. So here I have some examples of an example of an immigrant who just grew up in poverty and wanted to go to college and could not even pay for community college, and joining the Navy was really the only way for him to go to college because the military paid for it.
Is he a citizen?
He now is a citizen. He was not a citizen. And then others also, common reasons to join the military is I want to gain experience, or I know someone who I really admire and I want to be like them, and they're in the military. But some people did enlist to get U.S. citizenship. So the U.S. has a long colonial relationship with lots of countries, including the Philippines. And in the Philippines, until the 90s, you could join the U.S. Navy just straight out of the Philippines. And after many years of service, you would become eligible for U.S. citizenship. So I talked to people for whom joining the U.S. Navy was that they wanted to go to the United States. That was the only reason. They had no particular interest in any kind of military. But after 12 years of serving, they became permanent legal residents potentially. So it was like a very long-term plan to become a U.S. citizen. And then you have people who are joining the military to protect themselves from being deported. So I have an immigrant from Poland, and this was common. For a U.S.-born husband, marriage was breaking up, he has substance abuse issues, and she's worried that she will get deported because her marriage won't be considered valid. So she's like, what am I going to do? I'm going to join the Navy. So to protect herself, she did that. So I'm going to actually skip ahead a little because I know. Without going into too much depth, some people were not told about the U.S. citizenship benefit, or were not really interested in it, or more worried, like, will they let me in because I don't have it, rather than realizing that they would have this path of citizenship. And the recruiters didn't tell them, because I think they really just use that when they need to use that. Okay. All right, so there was also confusion up front. Okay, so just to finish up on some implications of this. So I think what I'm seeing in my research is that it's just more of defensive naturalizations. People are naturalizing as part of this greater context of attacking immigrant rights in general, just extreme levels of inequality in the United States, where the military becomes the only option for a lot of people. A lot of people, despite these special provisions, still don't get citizenship, and then they are a danger of being deported. Veterans in the United States have a tremendous range of problems, which make them extremely vulnerable for contact with the criminal justice system, and then they're deported. Right? So this is a great, huge social problem. But the solution, I argue, is not to then automatically make everybody a citizen, because what I'm seeing in my data is that there are people who do not want to be good citizens immediately, right? Especially you can immigrate and then join 2 weeks later, right? For all a variety of reasons. And the solution might be to make it easier, but not to make it a blanket naturalization, because that becomes coercive, and some people I spoke to would not have much relief from that. So I will end there. Sorry, I ran out of time a little bit. And happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so we have the last panelist. He's Javier TREVIñO RANGEL, and he's coming from CENTRO de Investigaciones y Docencia Económicas de Aguascalientes. Tiene un programa, they have a special program on drugs, and what's the name?
Drug policy program.
Drug policy program. And the name of his conference is Superfluous Lives, Migrants in Transit in Mexico. So welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we have, we are going to work 20 minutes more, and then 5 minutes to discuss at the end. So sorry, we have a delay.
So yeah, I'm going to change now the topic of our conversation, because I'm going to talk about migrants in transit in Mexico. This is, well, first my background. I'm a sociologist working now at SILVIA, research center in Aguascalientes, in the campus of Aguascalientes. And so I'm just going to present here some preliminary findings of this exploratory research, sociological research. The context of this research. Every year in Mexico, every year tens of thousands of undocumented migrants travel through Mexico. There are no accurate statistics on the number of migrants from Central America that cross Mexico. But what we know is 90% of them are from El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, and that they don't want to remain in Mexico. The final destination is the US. And normally most of these people cross the country in less than 90% of them cross the country in less than a month, and most of them in a week. In the last 25 years, human rights organizations have documented human rights violations against these undocumented migrants. Illegal detention, terrible conditions in some detention centers, lack of adequate food, medical attention, hygiene conditions, access to lawyers, or lack of access to authorities of their countries of origins, lack of access to medical attention in hospitals, and the way they are treated in prisons. And I'm sure some of these violations are similar in other countries, maybe in the US. So these are like sort of the normal.
Definitely in the US.
Well, and these are like the normal violations that human rights reported in the last 25 years. When I say normal, I don't want to normalize these. Just I just want to differentiate them from the sort of abuses that are suffering now. But then, in 2008, some organizations, normally shelters run by the Catholic Church in the north of the country, started documenting and reporting new abuses. And they found out that something happened in 2006, 2007, when President Calderón declared the war closed. Something changed with these violations. And so what they found was increasing number of illegal detentions, mass kidnappings. We know that 18,000 migrants are kidnapped every year in Mexico. That is, one migrant is kidnapped half an hour. And torture, ill treatment, sexual abuses, forced labor, disappearances, and killings. And the former UN Special Rapporteur on Migrants said Mexico has the highest rate of dead international migrants. In 2 years, he counted 1,500 dead migrants reported only by the press. And that's what we know. That is what we knew at that time, in 2008, more or less. Also, I have to mention that many human rights organizations, traditional human rights organizations, ignored these first reports because these reports were not translated into the language of human rights. So, and also because the idea that what was happening was, these are criminals killing each other, and so these migrants are maybe involved in something. So what happened? They got what they deserved. That was like sort of the idea. But then in 2010, we had this event that maybe you know, the San Fernando massacre, where 72 migrants were found dead in a ranch in Tamaulipas. And so this one guy was left to tell the story, and this guy told us what we already knew, like mass kidnappings, migrants are transferred to safety houses or security houses, which is an euphemism, because these houses are where migrants are kidnapped and then tortured and killed, and they are transferred to these safety houses in overcrowded trucks, and their journeys last for days. And once they are in these safety houses, they are starved, tortured, sexual abuse, and extorted. Some are selected for forced labor, some are selected for death. And but also the important thing about these cases in San Fernando massacre, some investigations revealed that what was happening was not only related to criminal organizations, but that all these mass kidnappings and some of these killings would not have been possible without the participation of some state agents. And then this became a human rights issue. Also, because in the San Fernando massacre, most of these migrants were kidnapped from ordinary passenger buses by members of the local police, the municipal police, the federal police, or immigration officers. And in many cases, these state agents deliver these migrants or hand them over these criminal organizations like Los Zetas. And these safety houses can work because they are protected sometimes by local authorities that know that these places exist. It is impossible not to know that these places exist because in some of these safety houses there are 600 migrants in the same place. And so when I was reading the literature on the case, I didn't find a lot of stuff on this subject. A couple of years ago when I started doing this, before I was working on transitional justice and human rights violations in the context of the war on drugs, but this is also related to the war on drugs. And for example, the journal International Migration, which is a journal published by the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, which is a well-distinguished university, has published one article in Migrants in Transit in the last 10 years. Or for Internacional, which is the journal published by the Colegio de Mexico, has published 2 articles on migrants in transit in the last 30 years. And these 2 articles were published 2 years ago. And in this context, analyzing this situation, because before this, migrants in transit in Mexico was not an issue. So most reports and analysis on the subjects come from rights-based organizations and NGOs working on human rights. And so the explanation they have is this, and it's there's an understanding of this, as a consensus on this. What is happening, most of these studies say, is the securitization of Mexican immigration policies. And all these reports says, the United States after the 9/11 is seeing migration as a security threat, and therefore the U.S. is imposing this policy on Mexico, and therefore that is why Mexico is introducing new and more restrictive immigration laws, invested more money, deployed more staff to deal with this security threat. And so this is more or less the explanation. But I don't know if this makes sense to see what is happening, these brutalities and these atrocities, through this lens of securitization, which maybe this can explain what is happening in the US, but maybe not what is happening in Mexico. So can this concept of securitization can help us understand the human rights crisis in Mexico or not? And if not, what does? And I think those scholars like myself now working in these migrants in transit are trying to make sense of what is happening. Some of my colleagues are now working in this field. Myself, I conducted 70 in-depth interviews with migrants in El Salvador, Guatemala, and also with human rights organizations and activists and experts in this field, and also state agents working or related to my immigration issues. So first I analyzed I tried to find evidence on this securitization in Mexico. And well, the basic idea of securitization is that you have more restrictive laws and that are linking security and immigration clearly. And that is why you're seeing immigration as a security threat. But when I review all these laws with all the colleagues who are lawyers, and the thing is, most Mexican immigration laws have been related to security since the 19th century. And I mean, it's not a new thing imposed recently after 9/11. And basically, even before, were even more related to security issues, but based on racism. Seeing immigration as a threat to our racial status, And the second idea related to this securitization is that now there are other state agents, not only immigration officers, implementing some new policies. And the examples of these reports published by NGOs is that now, for example, the federal police can implement immigration filters throughout the country to detain more migrants. And well, maybe, but this has been legal in Mexico for the last 40 years or 50 years. So it is, again, this is not new. This has been there for a long time. And finally, most of the securitization theories talk about you securitize something through discourse. You create something as a security threat. And when you read all these governmental discourses and programs and so on, most policies related to immigration are based and justified not thinking about security, but in the name of human rights. So these policies can be punitive and restrictive or whatever, but they are justified in the name of human rights. It is not like in other countries, like in the US or in Canada or in France, that some of these policies are justified in the name of security. So how can we explain what is happening in Mexico if we don't have this securitization, or if we don't have enough evidence to see this securitization? So let me just give you an example of a story that I took from a report published by Amnesty International. Amnesty International is among these NGOs talking about securitization. In 2008, members of Beta group of Beta, illegally detained 5 citizens from Nicaragua. This group of Beta is the body created by the Mexican authorities to provide humanitarian assistance to immigrants in Mexico, regardless of their nationality or their legal status. So this humanitarian branch of the Mexican government handed these 5 foreigners over to the local police in a small town in Chiapas. And they remained detained and incommunicado for 3 days with the local police. Then the local police took these guys to a ranch, and they stayed there for a week, and they extorted. One of these guys from Nicaragua opposed to be extorted, and he was raped as punishment. And after a week, the local police released these migrants and threatened to shoot them in the back. These guys ran and dispersed. One of them reached a Catholic shelter, and the staff of this Catholic shelter suggested this Nicaraguan guy to file a complaint with the special prosecutor for crimes against migrants in Chiapas. So there's a special prosecutor for crimes against migrants in Chiapas. So in order to wait for the process and the outcome of this criminal investigation, the Nicaraguan immigrant had to request a special humanitarian visa to be allowed to remain legally in the country. However, this guy disappeared without a trace, and so the shelter team fears that this young migrant was either threatened and therefore decided to run away or murder. So this story is like from Kafka land. Nothing makes sense, right? Humanitarian group created to protect migrants in a country that allegedly has restrictive policies. Humanitarian groups that illegally detain migrants. Special prosecutors designated exclusively to investigate abuses committed against migrants in a country where the government systematically denies that such abuses take place. And humanitarian visas emitted by the government as a protection against abuses committed by government humanitarian groups. So nothing makes sense. And so you can see here that all these officials who intervene in this process were not dealing with migrants because they saw migrants as a security threat, but because they saw migrants as a commodity. So I'm using this, it's okay. Yeah, so just with this story, it can illustrate what's more or less, like sort of nothing makes sense in this case, but clearly it's not only security. It's not the idea of the security threat. And not only, in this case I just mentioned security agents or state agents, but the problem is that in this process are taking place, of course, members of the organized crime, but also ordinary Mexicans, not only state officials and not only criminal organizations, but ordinary Mexicans that have never been involved before in criminal activities. Families in Chiapas who are kidnapping migrants because they see an opportunity to get some money. People who have never been involved before in criminal activities. So, again, how do we make sense of what is happening? And so, I think the securitization of my immigration will entail a process in which state officials show great concern about immigrants who are deemed to be a security threat. However, I think undocumented migrants in Mexico faces exactly the opposite process. The human rights crisis of trans migrants may be explained not as resulting from increased attention to them by the state or society, but rather because the lives of migrants simply seem not to matter in Mexico, right? In this context of the war on drugs. That is why I'm using this concept of Hannah Arendt, the concept of superfluity. and I think maybe this is what we are currently witnessing in Mexico, not a process of the securitization of immigration, but rather a process that has completely dehumanized trans migrants, stripped them of all dignity, and denied that they are anything more than what I call disposable commodities. The kidnapping of migrants need to be seen as part of a larger business. Yes, there are all these mass kidnappings are taking place, 18,000 migrants are kidnapped every year, and this business apparently generates $50 million. And beyond these kidnappings, most migrants, according to my interviews, have to pay between $2,000 and $9,000 to get to the US, not only to pay the smugglers, but also to pay security agents, in filters, in immigration filters or whatever, but also to pay basic services that are overpriced for them. For example, a ride in a taxi. If the taxi driver listens that you're speaking with a different accent, he charges you double. The night in a hotel, even to put salt on the table. Some migrants told me, if I'm in a restaurant in Veracruz, and they listen that I'm speaking with a different accent, if I ask for salt, they charge me 40 pesos to put salt on my. This is the ordinary Mexicans taking part of this business, because of course these services that are overpriced provided by ordinary Mexicans come with a warning. Either you accept this unreasonable rate, or you might be delivered to a criminal gang like Lucen does. So just to conclude, I think we have to explore other avenues, not only these ideas of securitization. Securitization may explain part of this, what is happening, this crisis, but I think it's rather a process of dehumanization taking place right now in the context of the war in Mexico.
Thank you so much. So we have like 10 minutes before 3, so if you want, we can discuss these 10 minutes, some questions for the panelists, and also the panelists, if you want to share some impressions, it's easy to do. So, Fernando?
Very brief question regarding the trade unions. What is the role of the Teamsters? Are there many immigrants, and how is the relation with the immigrant workers? And the second question is in relation to this very horrible situation of the trans migrants. Very recently, just on Saturday, there was a meeting in Miami of Mexico, the US, and the 3 countries where we get 98%, I think you said, of these people coming to Mexico to go to the US. Do you see any possible change? Do you think this meeting has a meaning? What is the near future for Central American migrants? Because it seems it's like hell for them in Mexico. And what is the meaning also for the Mexican government and the foreign policy and defending Mexican migrants, but at the same time not doing anything in relation to the people of Central America? Thank you.
So, si quieren hacer preguntas en español, Javier, no sé, está bien.
One question for the labor unions in the U.S. Sorry, I came a little bit late. My name is Roberto Cepeda from CISAN.
And he's also a researcher from here.
And I think it's very important the support that Donald Trump received from labor unions during the last elections, and apparently this level of support was not obtained by the Republican candidates since Ronald Reagan, I think. So do you think there was something like a negotiation between the union leaders and Donald Trump, or this support is coming from the this labor union decline and this negative or adverse situation faced by workers in the last 20 or 30 years in the US. So basically there is a question because apparently Donald Trump has a different agenda, and I think it's not in, he's not considering to support labor unions. Apparently, considering his appointments in the cabinet and all of this, has a very different, not very friendly agenda for labor unions. And also the other question is for Javier. And I don't know, I think also the war on drugs that you mentioned is important in this regard because those Zetas, as you mentioned, are apparently kidnapping these migrants from Central America, and also there is another factor explaining this, which is in Central America also, you know, when there was the war on drugs in Colombia, and then they came to Mexico, and this cucaracha effect, or I don't know how you say it, and then during the Calderon government and this Merida initiative, and they also used Central America as a center, as a hub for this drug corridor coming from South America. I don't know if it impacts on the migration. Now is more important, the migration from Central America to the U.S. than from Mexico to the U.S. apparently, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Another question or something else? Yeah, we can we can close these final comments. We have like 4 to 5 minutes.
Or I can answer. Well, we can answer, and then maybe we can.
Or you guys answer the questions that were directed to you.
And then maybe.
Yeah, the last one.
I think the impact of the war on drugs in this process. In the case of migrants, some of them now are forced to take with them to take part of the business, because you know if you're a woman, just maybe you have to you are used for sexual activities in these networks of losetas, and then you are involved also. First, you are an immigrant, but then you are victim of human trafficking. In the case of men, but also of women, in some cases they are forced to take some drugs with them as part of the payment of the journey. And in some other cases, there is some evidence that some gangs working in Central America are now working closely with some organizations in Mexico in this process. But also, there's evidence that some criminal organizations are diversifying their businesses.
Yes.
So now they are, before they were just dealing with drugs, but now they saw the opportunity to do human trafficking and smuggling and so on. And so I think it has like a clear impact now in this in this process, because as I was saying, immigration in transit in Mexico was not a sort of a big issue that deserved to be studied in the past, because before immigrants were, like in Mexico, I guess, going to the United States with a pollero, was a member of the local coyote, was a member of the local community and so on. But this changed clearly, dramatically after the war on drugs. About solutions, most organizations and most activists that I interview, they suggest that the law may have to change, the current immigration law. However, some activists and some experts say, if you see this new law we have that was published in 2011, the entire law is based on human rights. Because the idea of some NGOs is, we have to change this law because this is a very restrictive law. If we change the law, all this will change. But then some experts say, well, this law, it's based on human rights. And especially very sort of more radical activists and those working in shelters, the Catholic Church in the South, Greek Padre Solalinde and all these activists say, well, maybe you change the law, but the structures that make these abuses possible will survive and will be conducting their businesses anyway. So I don't have an answer, unfortunately. However, something that I think is important is this, and you mentioned this. The government is defending, the Mexican government is defending the rights of Mexicans in the US. And it seems that the government is not doing anything about this in Mexico. And maybe the government is, I don't know. But very important thing about in this context is the discourse of denial of the government. Because I didn't mention this because of the time, but the whole story can be framed in this discourse of the government saying, no, nothing is happening. Or these are not really human rights abuses, these are just criminals killing each other. And, or when there was evidence, like in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, then the answer was like, you know, this means that we're winning the war on drugs because now these criminal organizations are crazy, you know, seeking for other kind of markets. So this discourse of denial, of official denial, I think has contributed to make this problem invisible for a long time. And I think at least that's an important change that has to be.
This is right now.
And this is right now, exactly.
So thank you, Javier.
So I would just say, just to build on that, the discourse of denial is I think widespread, not just for Mexico, but elsewhere. But we see it also in terms of labor rights. In our interviews with the Mexican government around the role of Lado pushing for immigrant worker rights in the United States, the minute you talk to NGOs about their role in working with the Mexican government when it comes to the rights of Mexicans in the United States or the rights of returnees, there's a double face that the Mexican government will play. We're all for pushing for immigrant rights in the United States for workers, but for rights for Mexicans here. So I think it's tough. Okay, so just quickly, I think, so to get to your question, so the Teamsters, I'm not an expert on the Teamsters, but I think they're a good example of kind of a complicated story. So the Teamsters obviously have a storied past, but they were originally part of the Change to Win breakaway. So in 2006, there was a contingent of unions that broke away. Teamsters were a part of that. And immigrant rights were a big part of their agenda, even though the industries that they represent are highly immigrant. But this does vary from place to place. In Chicago, they do represent some factory workers, and there's not a large numbers of workers. So that's one way to ask the question of how many immigrants are part of that. The other way to ask it is to ask to what extent unions like the Teamsters are incubating or supporting worker centers and other non-union worker efforts, and there you see a very different population that tends to include many more immigrants. To get to your question of the unions and the Republican support, I think anyone who studies unions from a critical lens would be in no way surprised that you have a large contingent of Republican support. But I think there's two ways to get to your question. So your first question was there something, a quid pro quo, was there an exchange? And certainly there was, in a formal and an informal way. In a formal way, Trump has been very vocal about renegotiating NAFTA, doing away with TPP. He was very vocal, and we see that he wants to reverse the progress made on Keystone and Standing Rock and energy. So in all of those ways, there absolutely was an exchange. But then there's also a not so coded rhetoric of overt racism. And so in his rhetoric around Mexicans and other immigrants, he was appealing to a contingent of union membership that, economic benefits aside, see the demography of their trade unions changing. And for all the coalition work happening at the state and the national level, there's still very real tensions at the local level fed by for racism, and certainly complicated by economic inequality. But the building trades, even though they're increasingly African American and Latino, also tend to be overwhelmingly white men who saw great promise in the Make America Great Again, get rid of the Mexican rapist story that Trump was peddling. And even though you see at the national level a lot of formal changes happening with the AFL-CIO, they've signed on to a Black Lives Matter agenda. The new vice president is an Ethiopian immigrant. They have a new committee for racial and economic justice. The internal dynamics of the AFL leadership is still overwhelmingly white men who wield a lot of power. And so, yeah, I think that there was overt exchange, but then there's also just everyday racism and xenophobia that appealed to union members. And that's it's a platform of the Republican Party, but it's also a platform of the Democratic Party in a less overt way.
So thank you. So I think that we can conclude now. So thank you for everybody. Thank you for all the guests. Well, Carlos, well, you want to present? Like just, with your public.
Bernardo Méndez Lugo. I am a former diplomat, just recently retired by law, not because I wanted. And also I was the founder of Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Xochimilco for nearly 20 years before being a diplomat. And now I am director of a new foundation, pro-immigrant, very much focused on Central American trans migrants, and of course Mexicans, and also we look at other migration issues in the continent, like the Nicaraguans, nearly 1 million in Costa Rica, the exodus of Venezuelan professionals, and also migration of Bolivians and Peruvians to Argentina, and any issue that relates in the continent to migration. We are looking at that. We have the priority of Mexicans and Central Americans for now, but we are going to be looking. It's a very new, I have only 3 months, and the foundation has like América Sin Muros. América Sin Muros. I already sent all of you, except Javier that I didn't find. In LinkedIn, I asked for to be connected, and I can share some of my work and the work of the foundation and all the previous work I've done in 5 consular offices in North America. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I'm Miranda Romero. I work with Bernardo at América Sin Muros. I'm helping them to make all these politics and dreams come true in terms of public relations, and to make sure that all the events we are doing cover all the necessities of migrants, but also focusing on integration with the community, because as you have mentioned, sometimes the communities are very reluctant to accept the immigration people that are arriving. So it's to look a little bit further into installing these policies that work for the community and for the migrants.
Carlos Garrido, I am a professor at the University of Veracruz. To be honest, I am impressed on your speech, and I will be in touch with you through Dr. Paola, because we are working on immigration issues, specifically on education.
Thank you. So we have also Robert